Hugh B Sorensen was born February 20, 1930, in Kanab, Kane County, Utah, and was the youngest of Benny and Harriet Sorensen's 7 children. When he was born, his oldest brother Burke was 17, and Dorotha, the next youngest child, was 7. Hugh was a bit of a surprise. His mother said that it was like having a first baby. She'd given away all the baby clothes in the baby bed. And with 6 older children in the house, there was not much room for Hugh. So Benny made a tent room on the back of the house for Hugh to sleep at night. But because he was born in the winter, it was often too cold for Hugh to sleep in that little tent room. So Ray took him upstairs to sleep with him. According to their mother, Ray really loved having a baby around and took good care of Hugh. The family was busy, and everyone had their jobs to do. Hugh was so much younger than the other children that they just had to find a way to keep him busy so he didn't get in the way. They would give him simple chores to do, and he often got into situations that would give the family some comic relief. And the story that is told the most often about the comic relief is that the story of the bucket, the calf bucket. And the story goes that the dad had really one job, and that was to, in the morning, was to go down and close the calf corrals and make sure that everything was buttoned up and none of the calves could get out. And on the way back, he saw some kind of a stick or a board or something along the pathway that he thought looked like a rifle. So he picked it up, then he kind of put it up on his shoulder like a rifle, and he started marching along. And then he saw a bucket, which the bucket they used for the calves. And he thought that'd make a fine hat, so he put that on, and it had the handle made a nice little chin strap, and he put that on, and then he started to just march like he was in the army, and somehow he was so impressed with his marching that he wasn't paying attention where he was going, and he tripped and he fell. And when he fell, he somehow hit and caused that bucket to jam down over his head, and it jammed so tight it just was right, against his ears, and he couldn't pull it off by himself. And he started to cry and scream and yell. And as he did that, it just reverberated inside the bucket. And so it just got louder. And then he screamed louder. And it just got louder. And it screamed louder. And when he didn't come back, Grandma sent Voy and Mont down to check on him. And they went down to check on him and found him in this situation. And they thought it was kind of amusing, but they tried to get it off, but they couldn't get it off. And then the conversation went something like this. As Mont looked at Voy, and Voy looked at Mont and says, "What do you think we should do?" He says, "I don't know. So we could get some tin snips and take that bucket off." "I don't know. I'd hate to lose a good bucket like that. Maybe we should just cut off his head. There's no real value in that head. No one uses it for anything." And of course, Dad heard this, and he just screamed the more. And the more he screamed, the more they egged him on. And finally, Grandma came, and she couldn't get it off, and they finally ended up getting some tin snips and snipping the bucket off. But that's a story that they never let Dad live down. And when he was getting older, he kind of owned that story, and he took it on, and he was the one that would tell it. He could probably tell that story better than anyone. But the point was that as a young age, having a boy that young around the ranch, he wasn't much help, but he sometimes could be a little bit amusing. The older boys loved to tease Hugh. He would get up and try to go to work in the fields with them. And they would talk as if they would take him. But as they got ready to leave, they would hang him up on a hook by his suspenders, and he would hang on the wall in the tack room until he could yell loud enough for his mother to hear him, and then she would finally come and let him down. As he got older, the teasing just became more sophisticated. The older boys would pretend to have great plans to do something daring and audacious. Sometimes it was making a parachute so they could jump off the barn and float across the valley. Other times it was building an airplane that would take off from the roof of the barn and fly all the way to town. Hugh wanted to be part of this, but they told him that he was just too young. However, after a while, they would relent and let him help a little bit. And in the end, Hugh would always be the one chosen to test the parachute or to fly the plane.
The Sorensen boys used to tell a lot of stories, but the Sorensen boys back in Grandpa Benny's days, they didn't have a whole lot to do but tease each other and play pranks and things like that. And Uncle Voy and Uncle Mont and Uncle Ray, he never was much for teasing, but these other two were. So they decided what they were going to do is build a parachute. So they got a whole bunch of old gunny sacks and built this real nice parachute they thought would just open up and float down to the ground. And they drew sticks. Back then, you drew sticks to see who would get to do it. Well, Uncle Hugh, he said I was the lucky one. I got to be the one to fly that parachute. And he said they took it up on the hay derrick, which was quite high, and took it up on there. And he said he got that thing ready and had it on his back and everything, and jumped off the hay derrick. And he said that parachute beat him to the ground. And he said, if there wouldn't have been a little bit of hay and stuff on the ground there, it would have killed me. That's the parachute story.
As he got older, one thing Hugh loved to do was hunt deer. Hugh often told the story of sitting on the ridge, looking for deer in the valley below and enjoying a candy bar when things went terribly wrong. My father loved to go deer hunting, and when he came home from the service, he wasted no time in heading out to go deer hunting. And he borrowed a horse from his father, from Grandpa Benny, the horse named Trixie. Apparently Trixie was a fairly valuable horse. It was a race horse. They'd run on the local circuit. It had won a few races. They had high hopes for it. But Dad just needed a horse to go hunting on. And so there were some other folks with him. And when people tell this story, the details or the context is maybe a little bit different, but the essence of the story is always the same, and it's this. At least the way Dad tells it. They had stopped at a place, a location where they were at the edge of kind of a large drop-off, about 300 feet down. And Dad had got off his horse and tied it up loosely to a tree there, just wrapping the reins around the branches. And walked over and pulled his rifle out and walked over and was using the scope to kind of look down in the valley there and look across and looking for deer and looking for where they ought to go. And they decided that they ought to move over to a certain location. And so as he stood there for a minute, he reached in his pocket and pulled out a little candy bar. And then as he walked back, he threw the rifle over his shoulder and reached down and started to unwrap the reins of his horse from around the branch of the tree. And he did these motions about the same time, and apparently these motions and his proximity to the horse spooked the horse. And the horse started to rear back and really just started to panic. And Dad grabbed the reins and was trying to hold on to him, and his rifle dropped down onto his arm so that the strap you hold the rifle on was in the crux of his elbow and started dragging across the ground. So he was dragging his scope and his gun across the rocks and trying to get a hold of this horse. And he finally realized that he was not going to control this horse, that he was not going to get him calmed down. As he looked, he was getting closer and closer to the edge of this 300-foot cliff. So he finally decided the best thing to do was just let him go. He thought if he let him go, he would not feel threatened anymore, and he would get down on all fours and he would stabilize, and the situation would resolve itself. But he apparently waited just a little bit too long, or it took the horse a little bit too long to recover. But the horse continued to rear back, and by the time I think the horse realized that it was going over the cliff, it was just too late. And they all stood there and watched that horse go off that 300-foot cliff. And as they stood around there and looked at this sight, this horse fallen and then hitting the ground and looking at his rifle all banged up, and then he looked down at his hand and he held on to that little 5-cent candy bar. And the way he tells the story is, says, look, I killed a very valuable horse, I ruined his saddle, I ruined my gun, and all I had left was this 5-cent candy bar.
Okay, Grandpa Sorensen had a horse named Trixie, and they had taken her up to, she was a thoroughbred racehorse. They'd taken her up into Idaho, and she was really good. They run her on these cutters in the winter, and she was really fast and did a real good job. Well, they brought her home, and had her there in the fall, and they decided they would take her and go hunting. And so they saddled her up and said she was just really nice to ride. And they went out on the mineral points out here and was out there hunting, and they'd killed a deer. And they decided what they would do was, I hope this is the same one, they decided they'd load the deer on another horse. Well, the other horse kind of went crazy, and they brought that filly up there, and she was fine as she could be. And so they took the saddle and loosened it up, got the sticks out from underneath her back, and was cinching her up. And they cinched her up, I guess, tighter than she wanted to be cinched up. And she just went crazy, and she went backwards. And she went right back, and she went off this ledge and just went off about 10 feet. She didn't slow down, and the next thing they know, she was flying through the air 300 feet down. And when he had a 270. I still remember that 270. The 270 was in that saddle when she went off that ledge. And they had to go get Lenore Johnson. He was the sheriff. The only way they could get off in there was with a rope. And Uncle Hugh went off in that rope to get the saddle and bridle. It killed the horse. He said when he got down there, she did not have a bridle on her. She didn't have a saddle on her. And some of her hooves or shoes had come off. That's how hard she hit. But that is the story about her name was Trixie, and that bent the barrel on that 270. For some reason, I had that 270 for quite a while, and that was one of the straightest shooting guns. You had to have the back sight up quite high, but I killed a lot of deer with that 270, pump 270, but that went off the ledge with the horse.
Hugh grew up working on the ranch, and as he got older, sheep herding was his part-time vocation. He herded sheep for Roland Esplin and others. Roland Esplin was married to Benny's sister Valette. Sheep herding was his summer job when he was in middle school or high school. And to get out where the sheep were, he traveled across the desert with 3 horses. He would ride one and then switch out the horses as each became tired. It would take him 1 or 2 days to get to the herd. He said he could make it in a little over a day if he had good horses. Much of this work was on the Arizona Strip, and they would often encounter wild horses and cattle in that area. Hugh told a few stories about his run-ins with wild bulls. The first occurred when he was fairly young. Hugh came across a wild bull that charged him. The only refuge he had was the first small tree he could find. It was barely high enough to keep him out of reach of the bull, who was trying to climb up to get him. The tree was so small that Hugh was afraid it would break under his weight, and the bull would for sure get and kill him. He had to stay in that tree all day, and it wasn't until evening that the bull lost interest and then moved on. On another occasion, when he was a bit older, Hugh actually tried to rope a bull. He was on horseback, and he had a rope when he spied a wild bull. He gave chase from a clearing, and the bull soon headed for the cedar trees. Hugh was swinging his rope as he bore down on the bull, and as they flew through the cedar trees, the rope was whirring, and Hugh threw his loop and actually caught the bull around the neck. But just as he threw, his horse went left and the bull went right, and in between them there was a cedar tree. And Hugh knew what was about to happen, so he ejected from his saddle. And when the dust settled, both the horse and the bull were side by side on their backs, thrashing to get back on their feet. But neither could, because of the tension of the rope. The bull's horns were digging into the ground with every movement, creating an anchor. And for the horse, the saddle horn was digging into the dirt in a similar way. Hugh loved to tell that story, but he never did explain how he resolved that issue. Hugh attended Valley High School in Orderville. Their mascot was the Buffaloes. Hugh always described himself as an average student who was not much interested in classroom instruction. He often talked more about the fights he got into than anything he learned in class. He played on the basketball and football teams and enjoyed that. They traveled to other small towns to play. Hugh would describe these rivalries as a bit more than spirited. He said it wasn't enough to win the game, you'd also have to win the fight in the parking lot after the game. Hugh graduated from high school in the spring of 1948. For a while, he worked odd jobs. He herded sheep for some of the time. He cut cedar posts and sold them. He even worked as a jockey and rode horses in a local circuit. In December of 1950, he went to work for the Eagle Mountain Mine Company in Desert Center, California. It was while working in California that he received his draft notice. He returned home to visit his family before reporting for military duty. And it was during this time at home that he met Joyce Swap. Joyce Lorraine Swap was from Kanab, Utah. She was the daughter of Garn and Irene Swap. Garn Swap was a cattle rancher. They lived on a ranch near Alton, Utah. The ranch is along the Alton Road south of the Divide, and the ranch house was located on the north side of the Alton Road across from what are called the Levanger Lakes. During the school year, they would live in Kanab, and the rest of the year they would live at the ranch. After high school, Joyce went to San Francisco, California, and attended dental nurses training school. She graduated in July 1955 and returned home to Kanab. She was working as a waitress in a local restaurant when she met Hugh Sorensen.
He'd been working in Desert Center, California, and he got his draft notice to go in the Army, so he came to spend some time with, he had a couple of weeks, spent some time with Grandpa and Grandma Sorensen. And that was when I met him first. I was working at the cafe, Kanab Cafe in Kanab. It's a combination hotel. My girlfriend Sharon and I were working the night shift. And Hugh came in with a fellow from Alton named Jay Land, which everybody knew Jay, but he'd been in California working, so nobody knew who he was. And then they left, and when we closed up and started walking home, we went from the cafe to the corner, and then we were in the next block, was where we lived. And so we were walking home, and all of a sudden there were Hugh and Jay in the car following us along, and wanted to know if we wouldn't come and go for a ride with them. I said no. And Sharon and Jay were first cousins, and they had a little bit of friction there. We said no, and we got clear to Sharon's house, and they said, just come and ride to Fredonia with us. Well, you know, it's 7 miles, so it won't take us very long. So we finally said, okay, we'll ride to Fredonia and back. And we did 10 miles an hour, all the way down and all the way back. I can't remember how long it took us, but it was late.
Hugh reported for military duty. He was in basic training at Camp Roberts, California. While in basic training, he met Del Monte Truman from St. George, Utah. They became good friends, ended up in the same unit, and took the same boat to Korea. Not many of Hugh's units survived, but both he and Del Monte survived. Hugh served in the military from October 1951 until July 1953. He was a corporal in the United States Army when his service came to an end, and he returned to the United States via San Francisco. Like many who survived the war, he would not talk much about his time in the military. It would be years before he would begin to tell stories about his experiences in Korea. After his military service, Hugh worked doing construction work in Utah and Wyoming, and then later drove truck for Kaibab Lumber in Fredonia, Arizona. On October 15, 1955, Hugh married Joyce Lorraine Swap, that girl that he had convinced to take a quick ride with him to Fredonia. They were married at the home of Garn and Irene Swap in Kanab, Utah. Hugh was 25 and Joyce was 19. For their honeymoon, they stayed in Springdale, Utah the first night, and then took a tour through Utah and Wyoming, visiting friends and people Hugh had worked with when he was doing highway construction work. After the honeymoon, they settled down in Kanab, Utah. Hugh and Joyce had 2 sons, Nick and Benny, while they lived in Kanab. Hugh continued to drive truck for Kaibab Lumber, and he had some interesting experiences as a truck driver. On one trip, he was driving in an empty truck through Springdale just before Zion National Park at around 2 a.m. As he rounded a left-hand curve on the outskirts of town at a high rate of speed, he saw what looked like a little baby in diapers sitting on the white line that marked the shoulder of the highway. Not entirely sure what he'd just seen, he stopped and walked back to investigate. Sure enough, there was a little baby sitting on the white line. The baby wasn't old enough to walk, but had somehow made it out to the highway. Hugh said the baby was in no distress and simply raised his arms high, wanting to be picked up. Now came the real problem, finding out where this baby belonged. He was at least 100 yards from the nearest house, and there were several of them. He finally chose the one that he thought would be most likely the child's home, and he guessed right. So at about 2:30 a.m., he knocked on a stranger's door, holding their baby. What a conversation that must have been. In the end, the parents were a bit embarrassed, but grateful the child was alive after hearing Hugh's story. Hugh may have kept driving truck for a while, but he had some health issues. Riding in that truck all day seemed to hurt his kidneys, and at one point, he was hospitalized. He became ill while in Phoenix, Arizona, but fortunately, two of his friends, Gary Bundy and Garland Esplin, were with him at the time, and they drove back to Kanab. Hugh decided to stop driving truck for a living and got a job working at the Nevada test site, about 65 miles outside of Las Vegas. He went to work in August 1960, and in the fall of that year, Joyce and their two sons moved down as well. They lived in Indian Springs, Nevada, an Air Force base outside of Las Vegas. It now has the more politically correct name of Creech Air Force Base. When Joyce was expecting her third child, Vivian, she went back to Kanab so that her mother, Irene Swab, could watch Nick and Benny while Joyce had the baby. Vivian was born in June 1961 in Kanab, Utah. After a while, they left Indian Springs and moved into Las Vegas. They lived in the Atacama Tarn Trailer Park at Lake Mead Boulevard and Sandy Lane. They bought some land from a woman named June Ball and built a house on Gateway Road by Lamb and Lake Mead Boulevard. That house cost $20,000, and they felt like they had saddled themselves with such debt they could never pay. Just a few weeks after they moved into their new home, Hugh and Joyce's fourth child, Corey, was born. Hugh had a high tolerance for pain. There were a few notable examples of this. For a number of years, the family would continue to go to the family dentist in Kanab. When the dentist worked on his teeth, Hugh would not use Novocaine or painkiller of any kind. He would just ask the dentist to let him know when he was going to drill, and he would bear the pain until the dentist was done. Another example of this arises from one of Hugh's favorite pastimes, team roping. Hugh would try to go team roping as often as he could. For a number of years, Corey would go with Hugh as his team roping partner, and one night is particularly memorable.
So my dad, Hugh Sorensen, his passion was team roping, and I had the privilege to rope with him for a lot of years. And we were practicing one night at Henderson, Nevada, and my dad was a header, I was a heeler, and we went to rope this steer, and everything went just according as planned, and my dad rode out there, threw the rope, turned him. I came in, roped the heel. I only roped one foot, and so the rope was stuck around it. And when that happens, then I'm the one that usually goes down and takes the rope off the heel and rope off the head. So I go down and I do all that, and then I'm riding back. Now usually my dad has ridden back down, and he's lined up talking to his buddies again. But this time, he was still in the middle of the arena, riding in a tight little circle on his horse, looking down at the ground. And I was puzzled by this, so I asked him, I said, "What are you looking for? What'd you lose?" And he didn't answer me right away, and that was typical of Dad. And so I asked him again, I said, what's going on? What did you lose? And so he rode over a little closer to me, and he holds his hand up, and he's missing half of his pinky finger. And he goes, "I cut my damn finger off." And that's not uncommon in team roping to lose a finger. So, but I know my dad was pretty careful about that stuff, so it was a little surprising. So by now, a few friends had come back down, and now we got a few people riding around in little circles on their horses, looking for my dad's little finger. And after a while, I looked up, and my dad was facing me, and I could see the front of his saddle. And stuck in the rubber on the saddle horn, his finger was still stuck in that rubber, just kind of hanging out. And I said, your finger's stuck in the rubber on the saddle horn. And so he couldn't see it from the top, obviously, so he looked around and he grabbed it and he took it out, was holding on to it and examining it, and he didn't say a lot about it. And then, we decided that we got to get you to a hospital, try and get that sewn back on. And but in typical dad fashion, he wanted to take the horses home and get them fed and put them away and do all this other stuff. And then we'd think about going to the hospital and getting the finger reattached. So ultimately the doctors couldn't reattach it because the rope itself is about as thick as your pinky finger, and it tore it and didn't really cut it. It just kind of tore it and ripped it off. And that sounds really, really painful, which I'm sure it was, but my dad had a really high pain tolerance and pretty much acted like nothing had really happened. So we really had to convince him that he needed to go to the hospital and deal with this right away. So that's the story of how my dad lost his finger team roping.
Hugh was a gifted storyteller. People loved to hear him tell the same stories over and over. He particularly relished telling stories about his experiences, particularly those in which he was the foil or the butt of the joke. He seemed to be devoid of ego. He was also a good friend. He accepted people as they were and did not judge them. He was like Nathaniel, an Israelite in whom there is no guile.
Someone that enjoyed life, someone that enjoyed people. It was kind of funny that Hugh, I don't think he was really, he went to church and whatnot, but really never active, seriously active, I guess, until later on. But had friends from everywhere, every walk of life. People enjoyed Hugh, and it didn't matter who they were, where they come from. They enjoyed Hugh, and he was just a genuine person. He knew that they cared for him, cared for them, and he did. It wasn't just members of the church or whatever. He probably had more friends that wasn't members of the church than he did that was member of the church. And so it didn't really, he just enjoyed people, and he took them for face value, what they were, for bad or worse. He took them the way they were, and enjoyed people.
Hugh worked at the Nevada test site for 20 years. During that time, he was exposed to radiation. The workers had to go through a screening process before they could leave the site each day. Sometimes Hugh would have to shower 2 or 3 times before the radiation levels were low enough that he could leave. The rule was that if they showered 4 times and the radiation level was still too high, they would have to stay at the test site. He worked there for years, but in the early 1970s, Hugh was laid off in what would later be called an affirmative action layoff. He went back to work after a while, but the experience was hard on him. He and his nephew, Lee Sorensen, purchased a house moving business from Hugh's neighbor in Las Vegas, Ben Ford. They moved houses, school classrooms, and other buildings all across the Las Vegas Valley. That was Hugh's vocation until he died. Hugh was not much of a churchgoer. Hugh's mother said that when Hugh was young and Benny was bishop of the Orteville ward, Benny would make Hugh attend all the ward activities, even if they conflicted with a high school activity. Hugh would be the only one his age at the church activity while all his friends were at the high school activity. Hugh resented this, and as soon as he could make the decision, he decided not to attend church. Hugh was always a friend to the church and a defender of the faith. He just didn't like to go to church. However, one night, his bishop knocked at the door and asked to speak with Hugh. One night, we were sitting around our house in Las Vegas, and it was in the evening. Dinner was over, and Dad was watching TV, and he had this lazy boy chair that was sitting right across the room from the TV and right across from the fireplace. And you have the fire going, have the TV going, pull that handle, tilt that thing back, and it was a very comfortable position. He sat in that chair a lot in the evening. And all of a sudden, there was a knock at the door, and Mom got up and answered the door, and it was Bishop Shields, our bishop. Wally Shields, we call him. Kenneth Wallace Shields. He was a short, wiry guy from Australia. And he came and sat down, and Mom and Dad sat on the couch. They pulled up a chair, and he sat across from him, you know, like you do when the bishop comes to visit you. And they chatted for a minute, and then Wally looked at him, or Bishop Shields looked at him and said, "Hugh, I'd like to extend a call to you to be the Sunday school president of the ward." And Dad looked at him like he was crazy. Dad hadn't been to church in forever. Maybe he went on Christmas or Easter, but it had been a long time since he'd been to church. And the bishop just looked at him and didn't say a thing. And I thought Dad would say, "You're crazy," or "No," or, you know, he would say something like that. But instead, he said a remarkable thing. He said, "Well, who would I get for counselors?" Now, I don't know why he would say that as opposed to just "No" or "You're crazy," but that's what he said. Who would I get for counselors? And Bishop Shields looked at him and said, "I've already called them." At this point, Dad was stunned. He said, well, who are they? And he told him. It was two guys up the street, Bud and Roy. Two guys in the same situation as Dad. Hadn't been to church in years. Their wives went. Their children went. But they didn't go. And Dad looked at him a little puzzled at first, then skeptical. And he said, "And they said they do it?" And I remember Bishop Shields just smiled this big a smile, and he looked right at him. He said, "They said they do it if you do it." And at that point, Dad went real quiet because they'd committed, and now it was on him. And they were sure, I think when they said that Dad would say no. And now he was sort of stuck. And he sat there for a few minutes, and then he said, "Well, I don't think I would know what to do." He said, "I've got a manual, and I'll teach you." And sure enough, he said yes. And the next Sunday, there were three guys that no one had seen in years in the church building, wearing suits that hadn't seen the light of day in a decade and probably didn't fit very well, running the Sunday school. And this was back in the day when Sunday school had an opening exercises, so they had to stand up in front of the congregation and open a meeting, have an opening hymn, have an opening prayer, have a 2.5-minute talk, give some announcements, and then separate for class. And they pulled that off the first day. And you know, they were very capable guys, and they had that Sunday school whipped into shape in no time at all. And it was probably one of the best run Sunday schools that Ward had ever seen. And they did that for about 2 years, and then a new bishop was called, and they released a few people, and Dad was released, and he stopped going to church again. But for that 2 years, he may have been the best Sunday school president that Ward had ever had. Hugh served in a number of church callings during the rest of his life, including high priest group leader and ward clerk. However, while he was always willing to serve, he never really liked to attend church. It was a bit of a mystery as to what kept Hugh so firmly connected to the church, even though he did not like to attend. One day in sacrament meeting, he told a story that provided a clue.
Okay, so this is a story that I heard my dad tell in sacrament meeting. And I've never heard him tell this story before. And it takes place out on the Arizona Strip when he was a young man, perhaps 14. And he describes that he was there with a group of men, but he was by far the youngest. And they were there herding sheep, cattle, and there was a group there of men that he described as hard men. Perhaps these men were there evading the law because of the remote nature of where they were. But described these men as being hard, the kind of men who could reach into a fire, grab a coal, light their cigarette with it. Hard men. So, two of these men were LDS, if I remember the story. And one of these LDS men developed appendicitis. And as the day wore on, it became worse and worse. And they realized that they needed to do something. But they were so far away from the hospital that moving them from that location was not the best idea. So they just decided that they were just going to have to make him as comfortable as possible and try to get him through the night, although they weren't sure that he would survive. And later that evening, the pain became so bad, and he was making so much noise and so much pain that it was decided that they would administer a blessing. So about halfway through the blessing, the Spirit descended upon this group out on the Arizona Strip. And my father describes it as being a very thick, palpable presence. He said, so thick you could cut it with a knife. It was undeniable, and it was obvious that everybody in the group was very aware that something was happening. Now, I think my father was aware, being a member of the church, but I think this was the first time he'd actually experienced the Spirit for himself. And it was certainly the first time that these hardened men had experienced the Spirit as well. And about a little later in the prayer, the Spirit got thicker and stronger. And my father noticed that these men were all in tears. These hardened men were weeping like children. And I think that was a very powerful moment for him, because they did not know what was happening, but they knew they were witnessing something special. And as the prayer ended, the Spirit lifted, and my father overheard these men talking amongst themselves, saying, "Did you feel that? What was that?" And none of them had an answer. But they're all a little bit ashamed that they were crying, and they couldn't explain what just happened. But they knew that they had just witnessed a miracle. For the man stopped, his pain subsided, and he was able to sleep through the night, and they eventually got him the help that he needed. Now, I think the Spirit had a powerful impact on my father, but I also believe that seeing the effect that it had on these men, these hardened men, had a bigger impact on him.
In April of 1984, Hugh was diagnosed with colon cancer. At first, it appeared to be treatable, but that turned out not to be the case. Hugh's bishop called him to be a ward missionary. As he attended the training and heard from regional leaders and general authorities, a whole new world opened up to Hugh. He would later tell Joyce that he felt like he was learning what the church was about for the first time, and he wished that he had had more time to learn. About the same time, he was becoming a grandfather and wanted to have more time to spend with his grandchildren, but he did not have much time. Hugh passed away on September 30, 1984, just 6 months after his cancer was diagnosed. He was 54 years old. He's buried in the Orderville, Utah cemetery. He's survived by his wife Joyce and his 4 children and a number of grandchildren who have never known him.